Hello, Fiveable students. Mr. Lassiter here with you, and we're going to be taking a look tonight at key concept 6.1 of Unit 6, Time Period 6, looking at science and technology. It's great to have you with us tonight, everybody who's here. I think that we'll move through them quickly. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking more in depth about the Green Revolution, but I think a lot of what is in this is stuff that you might be familiar with, especially if you, know about science and tech, if you go to a STEM school, or if perhaps you talk a lot about it in your science classes. So a lot of that will be pretty straightforward tonight. Hopefully we'll leave time to answer some of your questions, and we can get started fairly quickly. So tonight we're going to be taking a look at looking at science and technology. Again, this is key concept 6.1 in the key concept. So if you ever take a look at those, I know that Amanda and Dylan reference those, and I do quite a lot. Basically, if it's not in the key concepts, you likely won't be asked about it on the test. So that's what we're pulling this from. Looking at science and technology, this is also sometimes called science and the environment. Again, my name is Patrick Lassiter. I teach, if you don't know, AP World History at a high school, Research Triangle High School here in Durham, North Carolina. Follow me or take a look at some of my YouTube videos if you need more info or you want some stuff more in depth than what we're doing here. Of course, Fiveable has been putting out some great content. These videos being free are really great. And the app is looking pretty exciting. If some of you are beta testing that app, thank you very much. I'm excited to be able to use it in my classroom. And yeah, so we're going to have a lot more content to come over the next few weeks, but let's go ahead and get started thinking about what we need to do for this key concept, or what's covered. So science and the environment covers new technology, science and technology, whatever you want to call this key concept. It covers new technologies that come about primarily in the 20th and now almost a fifth of the way through the 21st century. Remember, everything in this unit is 1900 to the present. And it has an impact on pretty much every aspect of your lives. We deal in this key concept with population growth and what that means for environmental pressure. And then lastly, diseases, innovations, and demographics. And this is a topic that is certainly tested a lot. It's been tested very recently, especially in SAQs. In 2018, the fourth SAQ was on the Green Revolution, which we'll talk about today. In 2017, there were actually 2 different short answer questions that touched on this topic of science and technology. It's a popular DBQ in the modern world. So last year's DBQ about trains moved into the 19th century, touched on this, though we won't be talking about them too much in this review. But also back in 2015, the first year I was teaching the class, there was a document-based question on the influenza epidemic of 1918. And way back in 2011, there was a DBQ all about the Green Revolution itself. And there are definitely multiple choice questions every single year on all of these key concepts. So you can expect to get questions about this on the test. And so if you have your own questions, just as a reminder, throw them into the questions later on. For example, the first question, will slides be posted? Yes, I share the slides with Amanda at the end of every week, and she posts them, and I believe they're accessible to people who have subscribed to Fiveable. So throw them down in there, and we'll move from there. This key concept, if we look at the wording itself in the key concepts, is that Rapid advances in science and technology altered the understanding of the universe and the natural world and led to advances in communication, transportation, industry, agriculture, medicine, all of these things. Now, the sub-concepts here don't deal so much with that altered understanding of the universe. So let me tell you just a little bit about what that's referencing. And it's primarily thinking about how our understanding of our place in the universe, how our understanding of space and time, and heck, even the world around us, how that changed as we have discovered more and more about space and time. Thinking about like Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, right, which is published in the first 15 years of the century, right? That changed our understanding of the universe. It changed our understanding of physics, especially. Then we have new understandings of our world, our own minds, with new studies in psychology. Sigmund Freud often comes up in those. He kind of changed the way we thought of ourselves, and then, of course, later on, subsequent understandings of science and the brain have disproven some of what he said. But we've also come to new understandings about, the makeup of life and what is possible in science. Not only have we discovered about the building blocks of life, and we've just learned about DNA, but now we are actively dealing with ethical conundrums of, can we modify DNA? At what sense is CRISPR, like, what should we do with this new CRISPR technology that allows gene editing and things of the sort? So when it's talking about these rapid advances, they alter our general understanding of where we fit in the universe and how our natural world works. We now ever, but we also understand it at a more complex level, and so arriving at answers becomes more complex. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about is not about those kind of conceptual changes in understanding, but more so about how it has affected us. So we're going to be focusing on the development of new technology, global population expansion, and our interaction with the environment. And the third one here, disease, scientific innovation, and conflict. Some of that you talked about last week. So let's get moving and first talk about new modes of communication and transportation. I don't think it'll come to a shock to you who is on the other end of a computer somewhere around the country, perhaps around the world, listening to a teacher in his office at his home in Durham, North Carolina, teach you about AP World History, or at minimum, maybe review stuff that you've already been taught. That is something that is it is new to your generation, right? That's something that was never possible before, but within the last 100 years, right, it's become more and more possible. Science and technology has increased the rate at which we have been able to communicate with each other as these new modes of communication are constantly developing. If we take a look at these images, right, in the 30s, 40s, before that, it was radio, right? That closed the gap. You could communicate nearly instantly with people. And that communication could be spread around the world. Well, think about how that changed in the 1990s. Although you weren't born yet, very likely, it was the internet. And this is like the cheesiest picture of that would deal with that surfing of the World Wide Web I could find. But man, that's what it was like in the 90s, if you want to know. And this idea that you could hop on a computer and you could talk to someone a world away, or you could find any answer to anything at your fingertips. Imagine like how that levels or could potentially level the playing field for people in different parts of the world. No matter where you're from, you might have access to information that you never would have had access to before, unless perhaps you had like the entire Encyclopedia Britannica set at your house. Of course, it was kind of unthinkable that eventually you could carry all of that access in your pocket. Perhaps some of you are watching this on your phone. if you are, hit a 1 in the chat. I'd love to know if anybody is doing that, if you're all on your laptops. So the idea that you have the entire world's knowledge in your pocket at any given time is just absolutely game-changing for how the world works. Revolutions have literally started with this technology. If you think about the Arab Spring back in 2010, in Egypt, organization was done almost entirely through Twitter, right? People just sending messages and organizing protests against the government, leading to its eventual overthrow. But this is just, something that's remarkable and would never have been achievable, or even maybe thought possible in previous generations, previous time periods. That said, this reduced problem of geographic distance has, of course, a lot of ramifications. It's hard to get out in front of things. The same way the printing press revolutionized communication in the 1500s, and helped the Protestant Reformation run wild. Those same types of things are your generation is reckoning with. So, I could ramble on about that, but I think you probably get the idea. I'm sure that being students of this day and age, your teachers are like me and ramble on about it for you in classes. On top of that, on top of just like the communication, which is so instant nowadays, keep in mind this 20th century, which this unit really covers, sees revolutions in transportation as well, not just communication. And one thing to keep in mind, like this is like a continuation from our last time period. Sometimes we think of it as like a break, right? Like, 1900 came along and it was an entirely different time period, but really it's not. It's a continuation of what we were seeing in the Industrial Revolution. The world was speeding up, technology was getting better, and was changing faster than ever. And so in the beginning of the 20th century, it's trains and then automobiles and eventually airplanes, right? And the idea that you are geographically distant from somebody is now, over time becomes kind of less and less important. In the early 1900s, the French and the Germans worried that trains would bring the other nation's army to their doorstep quickly. Now we fear that, or some people may fear that, enemies from on the other side of the world could get to us right away, right? There's those fears that also come up with this loss of geographical distance. However, globalization comes in and people are much closer, and we have a spread of culture. And I think if you look at all the positives of these technologies, we're seeing people come to greater understandings of other cultures, which is just an excellent development in world history. So long distances, not a problem anymore, right? People are connected more than ever by this science and technology. And that will lead to greater economic reliance, greater trade, right, between different countries of the world, as we see free trade agreements be passed. So just absolutely amazing. And this rapid advancement that I just want to highlight one more time to think about, I always like to put this in the perspective of thinking about European exploration of the coast of Africa and trying to get to India. Beginning around 1450 or so, the Portuguese start exploring the coast of Africa, and it takes them some 30 years or 40 years to get past the Sahara Desert. It takes them from around 1450 to 1500 to reach India by sea, right? So that's 50 years. Never mind the thousands of years we were unable to do it before. Well, in 1903, we take flight, right? The Wright brothers, whether or not you want to argue they're from here, this great state of North Carolina, or from the great state of Ohio, you can argue that in the comments. But 1903, we take flight, and 66 years later, we're on the moon, right? I mean, that is the speed at which technology is changing. What took thousands of years before, or hundreds of years, now is taking decades or less than decades, right? It took us 2 decades from the development and the widespread use of the internet to having it in our pockets. Just absolutely unprecedented in human history. Now let's move on to talk about kind of our next topic here, thinking about this advances in science and technology that spread throughout the world. The Green Revolution is a big topic in this key concept. It comes up on your test every year on the AP exam. Expect to see something about this, whether it's an image, multiple choice question, or whether or not they sneak it into another SAQ or maybe LEQ this coming year. We see in the 20th century changes in agriculture. Just as we are getting good at making machinery, and just as urbanization is growing, right, the world population is growing. We have to respond to that growing population with feeding it, right? And so we have to get better at agriculture. Just like we saw with the Industrial Revolution, people getting better with agriculture, learning to use things like guano to fertilize their crops. We get better at this in the 20th century as well. The Green Revolution is the name we give to this revolution, or this rapid change in farming that takes place in the 20th century, particularly after World War II, really in like the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. Ultimately, what we see with this green revolution, or this kind of newer agricultural revolution, is a large increase in crop production, especially in developing countries that have growing populations. And it's achieved through scientific technology, new fertilizers, new pesticides, and the development of high yield crop varieties. So literally using genetic modification of these crops, crossbreeding techniques, to create high yield crops that can produce more per acre than would be possible beforehand. Now, this process is, something that humans had done over thousands of years. If you look at, think about an ear of corn that would have been produced in the year 1850, it is going to have a lot more corn on it than if you look at like some what's the name of it? Like teosinte, I think is what it was called originally. Corn that was produced like in central Mexico in, 1,000 years BC, right? Humans naturally have over time selected crops that produce higher yields. What this green revolution does is it really takes that idea and applies science and scientific testing in order to develop extremely high yield crops. This is also in tandem with chemical agriculture, using very specific fertilizers to help put nutrients into the soil and help improve the yield of plants, and the use of pesticides, right, to cut down on crops being eaten by pests. I guess that makes more sense. You can tell I'm not an agriculturalist, but nevertheless, we see not just high yield plants, but also disease resistant plants be created by organizations which are like right here in the triangle where we live, that are literally down the street from our school and research, Triangle Park. BASF and companies like that, developing these new varieties of wheat, rice, other grains that can be grown around the world. And of course, why is it needed? It was growing world population following, in the 20th century, really ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. We can see here, even like after World War II, world population was increasing drastically. It has nearly tripled since 1960, right? We're on a pace for, I think, 8 billion people right now, and then 9 billion people by 2050, and it'll level off somewhere between 9 and probably 11 billion at some point. But you have to feed all those people. And so developing these crop yields have allowed us to feed them. I love this chart on the left side of this screen. You can see how much wheat was being created in developing countries in 1950 compared to today. And we're talking about 5 to 6 times as much to deal with the problem of hunger. Now, what that leads to is certainly a lot of effects, certain positive and negative. The image you actually see on this screen is Norman Borlaug. He's considered the father of the Green Revolution. He won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize for developing science behind this genetically modified agriculture. And when I say Peace Prize, I do mean Peace Prize. It was seen as a way to you reduce hunger in the world, you can reduce conflict in the world. So it wasn't just like a prize for chemistry or science or whatever else they give out, but literally for hoping or possibly staving off conflicts in the world. Anyways, the effects of this green revolution you need to know. Number one, increased agricultural productivity. That's sort of in the definition of the green revolution and what it did. Secondly, the spread of chemically and genetically modified forms of agriculture, right? You always hear stuff probably about GMOs and, these foods have GMOs or these foods don't have GMOs or whatever it might be. Pretty much all scientists agree GMOs are perfectly safe. We've been using them we call them by different names throughout history, but this spreads that agriculture. Of course, more food leads to continued population growth, right? That doesn't stop just with the green revolution. You can see in that previous slide, that our world population is still increasing, and part of that is for things unrelated to the green revolution, but also more food is going to lead to and healthier people are going to lead to longer lives and larger populations. That said, there are some negative consequences of this green revolution, and so we have to think about it. First of all, the science behind this is expensive. Large corporations own the patents on very specific strains of these new crops. And so they need to make money. They sell their seeds to farmers. And to continue funding this research, it's certainly very controversial. You can probably find lots of people on both sides of the argument, but nevertheless, it's an expensive process to research and create these crops that are disease resistant, that are pest resistant, that are high yield. And so these businesses try to make that money back. And because it's so expensive, we see a lot of small farmers having hard times competing with large landowners. Many small farmers throughout the developing world ended up having to sell their land to larger landowners who could afford to buy these high yield seeds because small farmers just couldn't compete with the prices that these high yield farmers were driving. And then the last of these kind of negative consequences is that small farmers have a hard time, that chemicals and mechanization continue to be used. One thing I've talked mostly about the green revolution in terms of GMOs and the use of chemical fertilizers, but there is also this idea of commercial agriculture. In much the same way that the factory systems and economies of scale worked for industry, we can see the same thing for agriculture. And so the mechanization of agriculture, which of course puts people out of work at times, that give preferences to larger landowners who can afford this mechanization, that is going to be one of the reasons why we see those are positive and negative consequences, right? This mechanization of agriculture, this commercial agriculture is going to increase food yields, right? It's going to make food cheaper. It's going to make it more available. At the same time, people out of work, environmental damage is definitely one of the effects we see coming out of this. So that's kind of in line with the green revolution. We have one more topic before I kind of take a break to answer your questions. I see that we have 4 questions down there right now, so I'll open those up in a minute as soon as I finish this next little section, and then we'll answer them. So if you have a question right now, go ahead and pop it in the chat, down at the bottom. All right. The last thing here for at least or the last couple things with this first part of the key concept is also to think about new technological breakthroughs in medicine and energy, right? So, for example, and you can imagine probably the effects on demographics if at the same time, we're thinking about the effects on demographics of the Green Revolution, population explosion, population growth. Same thing's going to happen if you give people the chance to live longer lives. Two medical innovations really stand out in the 20th century, and that is the development of more sophisticated vaccines and antibiotics. Keep in mind, like diseases like polio have been eradicated in the developed world and nearly eradicated completely around the world. Vaccines for measles, for example, you've probably heard a lot of that in the news. When I was little, I had chickenpox. Now there's vaccines for chickenpox, which I learned the other day, of all things. Put in your chat if you put a 1 in there if you knew that there was a chickenpox vaccine. You may not even have known that you received a chickenpox vaccine as a kid. I simply did not know this until the other day. And my wife, who is a biology teacher, AP biology teacher, actually told me this. And so I had to call my sister to ask if she got her kids a chickenpox vaccine. I was mind blown that was the thing. As a kid, I had to suffer through it. Not anymore. Certainly antibiotics are also something that certainly were helpful in war. You may have heard about them or talked about them in your class in terms of the development of antibiotics to fight off diseases and wars. But penicillin is like a great example of this, ways to deal with bacterial infection. But simply put, these vaccines, these antibiotics, vaccines especially, really help to contain the spread of communicable diseases. You can see in the chart at the top, if only some people get vaccinated, the viruses can spread easily. If most people get vaccinated, the spreading is contained. Perhaps in your school, you're dealing with like flu outbreaks this year, right? Depending on the year, the flu is a very difficult virus to get a vaccine for, to make an effective vaccine. Some years it's more effective than others. But then some, like measles or polio, right? Chickenpox, we have vaccines that really work for those things. The only thing is you just got to get vaccinated. The chart here at the bottom may be difficult for you to see, is the number of measles cases in the United States over by year, going back to the 1950s up until the present day. And so measles, something that my parents or your parents or grandparents may have had to deal with, no longer an issue if you're getting vaccinated. That said, in the last decade or so, a number of measles cases have been on the rise, and that is primarily as a result of an anti-vax movement. So here's my plug: get vaccinated. Don't get measles. Don't spread measles, etc. Next thing and the last thing that goes with this is thinking about other technologies that develop. And of course, one of the more important technologies to consider are the energy technologies. Of course, as our population grows and our world becomes more developed, we have greater and greater energy needs. And of course, the use of petroleum power or fossil energy from fossil fuels is something that continued from the 19th century into the 20th century. In the 20th century, we see the dawn of nuclear power. And we see these new energies sources, these new energy technologies raise productivity. It actually will increase the production of material goods as electricity is available more throughout the world now than ever before, which is something interesting to think about. But we know that technology is constantly changing, and will that continue to be the case? Will we still rely on fossil fuels? Will we rely more on nuclear? Will we rely more on maybe cleaner energies like solar power, wind power, whatever it might be? The most recent Wikipedia data I could find in 2014 showed that we're still relying mostly on non-renewable energy resources. That still probably more efficient than ever before, but renewable and clean energy sources, nuclear energy, seems to be on the rise. All right. That is a lot of new technologies that we have just gone over, whether it be communication and transportation, or technology and food production, or medical innovations, or energy technologies. I got to step down off my podium, my high horse here, and answer some of your questions before we move on to our next section, in which we're going to think about our interaction with the environment. So let's take a look at some of your questions, the ones that you want answered the most. First question, what were the effects globally of the new technology in this time period? Well, good question. Dylan has started a really great answer for this, and thinking about globalization, especially if we're thinking about, we can think about each technology even, and I'll try to go through them pretty quickly, but if thinking about communication and transportation, certainly globalization and the idea of like greater interconnectedness of our society, right? That is greater reliance, more integrated economies, the sharing of ideas. You could go even into like the spread of democratic ideals, right? The internet might be like the greatest experiment in democracy in history. I mean, people can share their ideas for the most part, whatever those may be, for better or for worse, right? Just what a great experiment that is. In some places where people may not have the same freedoms, perhaps on the internet they have greater freedom, or as long as maybe they're using other servers. The Green Revolution, thinking about global effects of the Green Revolution. So not just effects in developed countries, but in feeding people in newly developing countries, or countries that were not quite yet developed, trying to stave off hunger in many places. That said, has it been entirely effective? No, certainly not. Just in my lifetime, we've seen famines in Ethiopia, right now in Yemen, associated with war, of course. So it hasn't 100% solved the issue, but it has made a dent in it. Medical innovations certainly have helped people survive, live longer lives, has taken some of these, in some parts of the world, perhaps where there's more needed, right? There's still efforts to try to eradicate diseases like malaria in Africa. So a lot of scientists working on that. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation does a lot of really great work in those fields. And then energy technology, certainly around the world. And that's something, if we think about our effect on the environment, we have to consider where's energy going in the future, who's going to be the leader in new energy technologies. As more countries begin developing, right, what does that mean for our energy needs, energy usage? Places like China, for example, are consuming massive amounts of non-renewable energy resources. What does that do to our climate? A lot of those things play in. So there's a lot to it. It's a good question, and one that we probably don't have time to totally answer today, but I hope I made a dent in it. Next question says, while transportation technologies caused environmental damages, do communication technology have the same influence? So this question, I'm not exactly sure what it's aiming at. It might not be typed in exactly as you mean it, but transportation technologies definitely have an impact on the environment, right? Just the sheer use of fossil fuels in our automobiles, right, and our airplanes has caused environmental degradation. Modern communication technologies use a lot of energy, right? And so that energy is coming from somewhere. It's being produced by one means or another, whether it's nuclear power, coal power, petroleum, natural gas, whatever. And then if we think about what is now kind of thing, like the race for batteries, right? And these like lithium ion batteries, we are seeing like increased mining for these rare earth elements. So in that way, I think definitely we're seeing environmental effects of our technology that we use. Next question, why is the anti-vax trend exploding in recent times? That's a really good question. I think I don't have the full answer. A partial answer might be that democracy of the internet, right? Anybody can share their ideas, they can get them out there. And so, it's something I think we try to do in schools is teach you how to find good information and reputable information. Peer-reviewed scientific journals are always the best place to go. It's been kind of a very recent trend, and I think there has been a lot of pushback in the last few years against anti-vaccination trends, especially as we see outbreaks occurring even in the United States. All right, what are problems that communication and transportation can lead to in the future? Ooh, if you know the problems and you can solve them, you could probably make a good living. That's I guess it's tough to predict the future, but what we can look at is perhaps some complications of the past. Transportation and globalization led to perhaps greater tensions in some areas of the world in the past, right? Britain building, whether it's building railroads in India, connecting people, and or whether it is the U.S. and Soviet Union competing to increase transportation in countries during the Cold War, or whether it's China's it's called the Belt and Road Project. I think it's their kind of global plan to build roads, build connections of ports around the world to increase Chinese presence in trade, right? So I don't know if I'd call that a problem, but it is definitely something that we're going to see in the future. All right, take a couple more. If the Green Revolution causes a negative environmental damage to lands, will that cause a decrease in crop growth and cause the population to decrease again? So that is a possibility, right? That might be a possibility. But remember, the Green Revolution does cause environmental damage in that more and more land is being planted. So when we're talking about environmental damage, we're thinking about like deforestation and like chemical runoff that can enter water supplies. That's the type of environmental damage we're thinking about here, not just soil depletion. The chemicals that are put forth, the fertilizers that are used, often can restore that soil. And so I would say we're not likely to see like a decrease in how much food we're producing unless it's done with complete irresponsibility. However, if you look at a place like Brazil, they're continually clearing more rainforest to plant. That is certainly like a negative environmental effect, as we're still trying to keep up with this growing population by planting more and more. There are trade-offs, right? You have two things: preserve the environment or feed people. And so in some cases, those trade-offs are made. Whether or not you agree with those trade-offs is kind of up to you. But I would not, I'm not necessarily a pessimist in thinking that we're going to have some kind of global population decrease, although never say never. You never know. I'm not that type of scientist. What would happen if the productivity of agriculture increases and the population goes down? So that what if question, I just don't know if we can answer. I don't know if it's productive to answer, because it's kind of, you wouldn't expect agricultural productivity to increase and population to decrease necessarily, but we probably will see a leveling off. And I'll talk maybe about why that might be later on. Generally, what we see is family population size is decreasing overall in developed countries. So as less developed countries become more developed, we'll see, instead of massive population growth there, kind of a leveling off. All right, let's keep going forward. I'm going to take a little drink. There's some really good questions. I wish I had better answers to some of them, but you have some tough questions on this. I need to get out my oracle bones. Maybe I could come up with some better answers to some of these future-driven questions. Shout out to Time Period one with that joke. All right, let's take a look at humans and the environment. So this is getting to a lot of what your questions were about. And so here I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the effects on the environment that you might be asked about or might have to be familiar with. So as the key concepts say, in this kind of period 6, 1900 to the present, right? We are in a period of unprecedented global population expansion. I showed that image earlier, even from 1950 to the present. But, you know, the world population has, like, what is it, doubled every 50 years or so. Just massive population growth. And with a growing population, of course, there are more demands on the environment. So humans have fundamentally changed our interactions with the environment. We've already looked at one example, right? The Green Revolution, like the growth of we've looked at more than one, actually, I guess, with the rise of like needing certain energy technology. You know, we're in the last unit, we saw how that changed at the Industrial Revolution. We're constantly expecting more and more out of our environment to meet our needs, our growing needs. So, you know, we are changing our interaction with the environment. Human activity has contributed to deforestation, which you see in the picture in the top left here. It has contributed to desertification, which means like the growth of desert territory. We see that definitely in like the Southern Sahara Desert, where over farming leads to soil depletion, and then soil can blow away and we can lead to more desert-like conditions. Or, as often happens, that growing population puts greater pressure on the world's supply of fresh water. And so, and those can create more desert conditions as the freshwater conditions cannot keep up with our human population growth. We've tried to find ways to deal with that, and you know, it's a tough situation that impacts some areas of the world more than others. For those of you who are in, I keep asking people like where they're from today. I don't know. Like if you're out in California, you might know this more than others. So you know, put a 1 in if you're from California, because you might know this idea of you know, this of not having access to water. I think when I was out in California a few years back, you know, there were very strict rules set in place during a major drought of like how much water people could use and when you could water your lawn and things. Those are things that when I grew up in Georgia, you know, we never had to really worry about. Yeah, so there's that, you know, increased consumption of the world's supply of fresh water. In some places, right, we have problems with pollution and not having enough, or having worse kind of air condition. That's not a good way to put it. Lower quality air to breathe. Certainly, that's something that's felt in developing nations of the world, especially like in places like China or maybe Atlanta, Georgia. And as a result, we also see, you know, all of these kind of negative impacts of our environment. You know, we're competing over resources more than ever before. And in some cases, that leads to conflict. In some cases, you know, whether it be conflict over oil, right? The first Gulf War between Iraq and Kuwait, the United States comes back and forces Iraq out of Kuwait. You know, it's access to oil is a major part of that. You know, a lot of the U.S.'s international interests have to do with access to supplies for resources. So that plays a role. Beyond that, other kind of things that we see is, of course, the extinction of species, which is happening at an increased rate. So all of these are, you know, as a result of this growth in human population and increased pressure that we put on our environment. You know, this idea of greenhouse gases, other pollutants in the atmosphere, the key concept says this contributes to debates about the nature and causes of climate change. which is a nice way of kind of a PC way of putting it. But we definitely see climate change happening in our world. And this I pulled from NASA. Multiple studies show that 97% of more of actively publishing climate scientists agree that climate warming trends over the past century are extremely likely due to human activity, right? The pressure we're putting on our environment, the gases and pollutants that we put in the atmosphere are having an effect on it, which is why, what is it, like something like the 10 warmest years on record have occurred in the last 20 years. And so I'm sure that you've heard a lot of Bill Nye, so I won't go all Bill Nye on you. But what we do see is that we are putting a lot of these we're putting a lot of these I lost my words, these gases into the atmosphere, right? Whether it be from our transportation, whether it be from farming or industry, or just the electricity we consume. And what we also see is that those greenhouse gases are causing an increase in warming trends. And we think we can call it global warming, but climate change is kind of more of the scientifically accurate because we're seeing overall warming of Earth, but more erratic weather and climate patterns than we've had in the past. And if you live anywhere like on the East Coast, you may have experienced this with hurricanes or storms of some nature. All right, so this is the great debate. If you've ever seen Last Week Tonight, he held a representative debate, 97 scientists versus like 2 climate deniers. So let's take a look back at your questions. We have a few questions here. Oh man, y'all are asking lots of like, what do I think questions. It makes me feel real special. I do have to say that you value my opinion on determining or trying to make some kind of judgment on the future. Although I caution you in listening to me. If there was a period 7, do you think technology further expanding would be a key concept? Yes, I think technology. If you think about this course from unit to unit, even back to unit 1, right? Only 5% of the course. Technology and the development of early technology for humanity is an important part of our key concepts then. And then as we go through the course, it becomes more and more important. Even if we're thinking about, in the time period 1450 to 1750, right? How new technologies contributed to the exploration of the world, right? Then we get to the Industrial Revolution unit. Now we're in this unit. Technology continues to play a more integral role in our lives. And that's a trend that we see throughout history. Also kind of the pace of technology, right? Speeding up. I think it'll be, maybe by the time you're teaching the course, there will be a unit 7. All right. Did the spread of the Green Revolution occur globally at once, or did it follow a similar path to the Industrial Revolution? So I would probably ask you, like, do you think, it would have been a slow process or a quick process? And considering that history seems to be speeding up, technology speeds up, the Green Revolution does occur pretty rapidly, much more rapidly than our Industrial Revolution does. We see the development of these seeds, these new genetically modified plants, and it definitely spreads very quickly, relative probably to anything that we see in the past, right? Because technology now can spread faster than ever before. Even like cell phones and cell phone technology, you go pretty much any place in the world, you'll see people with the iPhone. That's something that spread way faster than even radio or television before, right? So it spreads relatively quickly. If I wanted to give you a date, it through the 60s and 70s, within a couple decades, I think we would say that it becomes fairly commonplace in a lot of developing nations. Thank you, Hannah. Shout out to my history class, where Hannah comes from. And then, am I going to allow access to the slides? Yes, I send those to Amanda, and I think she uploads them to the Fiveable site. So I will make sure she does that. All right, so let's enter kind of our third part of this discussion of science and technology, and how it has changed our world, our lives, and I don't know, whatever else we want to say. It's been real. So let's talk about demographic shifts. Disease, scientific innovations, and conflicts are going to lead to demographic shifts. Generally, the demographic shift that we're talking about is a growth in population, but that is not 100% the case. We do see in some places, whether it be localized or worldwide, losses in population due to some epidemics. So first of all, let's talk about for all kind of history, there are diseases that we associate with poverty. People in impoverished parts of the world who can't receive adequate medical care or can't deal with outbreaks of disease. And so in this time period, throughout the 20th century into the 21st, diseases that we associate with poverty persist, while other diseases emerge as epidemics and threats. And we could say even maybe perhaps threats to human survival on a local or larger scale. So let's first talk about diseases associated with poverty. I've pulled this graphic from Freemanpedia. I'm sure a lot of you know Freemanpedia. It's just really well done, kind of summarizing what you see here. But we do see the continuation of certain diseases associated with poverty. Certain areas of the world, malaria still impacts populations. You can see in the map here on the bottom left. Let me see if I can get my pointer out. There, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, malaria continues to be an issue, even though it's been eradicated in the United States, and that there are medications to prevent the transmission of malaria. It is very hard to get that infrastructure where it needs to be, get mosquito nets where they need to be, and get malaria medication available in the interior of Africa, right? That's a very difficult thing to do. Even cholera. There are still cholera epidemics, mostly in developing areas of the world. Tuberculosis, another disease that is not very common at all in our country, but is seen in countries with lower GDPs, greater poverty. In the 20th century, though, it's not like we're free from epidemics. There are new epidemics that spring up in sometimes very localized areas and in some case large scales. The most famous of these is the 1918 influenza epidemic. And that occurred on the heels of World War I, as people came home from war. Sometimes we call it the Spanish flu. As people came home from war, they brought with them this influenza virus that was particularly nasty and devastating, leading to the deaths of millions of people worldwide. I'm actually going to do a quick search because I want to give you an idea of how many. It was the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was the deadliest in history. It infected an estimated 500 million people worldwide, which was about 1/3 of the world's population at the time. This is in 1918, mind you, so about 1.5 billion people. And it killed somewhere between 20 and 50 million people. It killed about 600 to 700,000 Americans, right, in our country. But it killed millions in places like India, in Europe. So it was absolutely devastating worldwide. That is something, of course, that could, we say we have everything in place. We definitely have vaccines in place, but the possibility, with how interconnected our world is today, that another major epidemic could break out is always something that scientists are reckoning with, and that's what the CDC does, and making sure that these things do not happen. More localized thing to consider, like the outbreaks of Ebola. Ebola, which is seen mostly in African nations. It was primarily, I believe, in like Southern and Eastern Africa initially, but over the last 5 or 6 years, there have been outbreaks in West Africa as well. And then also beginning in, I guess I don't know the exact beginning date, maybe the 70s, and certainly there was the epidemic of the 80s, the growth and spread of HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, which leads to AIDS, the autoimmune deficiency syndrome. And this, we see large numbers of people nowadays living with AIDS, or with HIV, excuse me. And we now have the science to make this a disease, a virus that a person could live with. But there still is no absolute cure. I think there are 2 recorded cases of cures of this virus. But it is something, of course, that people are working toward, trying to eradicate HIV through education, mostly, access to information, and to what's the word for it? Birth control, condoms, lots of other stuff. So just access to things to make sex safer for people, because that is primarily where HIV is transmitted. So those are some things that are kind of at work with these new epidemics that we see in the 20th century. The 1918 flu epidemic, I would expect you to be asked mostly about. That would be the one I would say you'd probably get a question on. Contraception, that's the word. Thank you to our person in our chat, who I was not looking at the chat right now, but man, you would have come in handy about 2 minutes ago before I was drawing a blank. You'll definitely probably see some questions, about the influenza epidemic. You may see some stuff with Ebola. You may see some stuff with HIV and AIDS, but just kind of keep those in mind, that the 20th century, just because we have the scientific technology, does not mean that these epidemics stop. They're still there, though we can mitigate the effects of them. And then the last thing that really goes with this disease is this idea of disease is that because we're seeing people live longer lives, we're seeing increased longevity of people's lives. We're seeing actually diseases on the rise that are associated with people living longer lives, and changing lifestyles. Diabetes is one, right? So as people get older, then increased chances for diabetes. Also, as people are living less healthy lifestyles, right? Eating more sugars, maybe not exercising very well, increases for diabetes increase. Heart disease, right? These are, that can be associated with lifestyle as well. I mean, obviously genetics, but it can be associated with lifestyle, as well as things like smoking, right? Can increase your chances of heart disease. So, just the way people have lived their lives can, and especially as people are living longer, we're seeing these specific lifestyle threats, or lifestyle related diseases, like the rise of Alzheimer's, dementia, those types of diseases that we're still trying to get a handle on and trying to understand in the scientific community. We see those increasing as people are just living longer lives. So those are some things to consider in terms of thinking about demographic shifts and disease. In general, we now have a lot, the science, we have the medicine to deal with a lot of these and mitigate the effects of them. And so we're not going to see massive, at least now, these days, we have not seen massive impacts on our population as a result of them, which is something you might be thinking about. However, they are, something that we have to deal with and we have to be out in front of. All right. Last thing from the key concepts here. I guess there actually is one more thing, but it's something y'all talked about last week, so I'll be through it in a second. And that is that if we're thinking about demographic effects, we have seen, especially in developed countries, or a leveling off of population, or in some cases, a decrease in fertility rates, or how often women are getting pregnant and having children. And that is as a result of more effective forms of birth control, contraceptives, which have given women a greater control over fertility. And then it has also had a cultural effect in transforming sexual practices. So examples of this: effective birth control, more effective condoms, the birth control pill, a whole host of different types of birth control that can be used and are much more effective, along with better education in those as far as sexual activity goes. There is the availability of abortion in many places in the developed world. The United States, it's been legal since the 1970s. And so those things have given women greater control over their own bodies and greater control over when they have children. And you can imagine how this might transform sexual practices. It goes along with the sexual revolution in the United States and in some areas of Europe of the 1960s and 70s, giving people kind of greater freedom, changes in attitudes towards sex. And then there are other consequences of this too, right? Greater opportunities for women. If they are in charge of their own bodies and when they have kids and they can make those choices, then they are more likely to be able to have careers, more likely to be able to participate in the business world, choosing when to have kids and when not to have kids, when to go focus on career, when not to. Whereas in the past, if a woman was not able to be in charge of that and had children, it may have taken her out of that opportunity and limited perhaps those opportunities, especially as we think about maybe the patriarchy of the past. So what we see generally in the world is the decrease in fertility rate as countries become more developed, decreases in family sizes as people have more control over when and how they go about having children. And that is one of the things that we'll see with the leveling off of population, and that we expect with the leveling off of population in our future. Now, the last thing, demographic shifts. Certainly one thing that we see is new military technology, new military tactics. The waging of total war led to increased levels of wartime casualties. This is something that certainly has been covered in your discussion of the world wars. Just keep in mind that technology has played a large role in these military conflicts that have led to, at least in the 20th century, unprecedented death. Whether it would be tanks in World War I and World War II, or the increased use of airplanes or atomic weapons, right? We have seen the ability of technology to have a massive impact on the global population. Nowadays we have drones, right? So these technologies are still being developed and still becoming more efficient. New tactics that this key concept references, dealing with like trench warfare in World War I, blitzkrieg in total warfare in World War II. If we think kind of going toward the future, what might our world look like? Would it look like drone wars and the use of robots, right, to carry out war? How much more destructive might that be, or might it be less destructive if war is fought in a different manner? Whatever the answer is to that, technology is surely going to play a role, just as it played a role here in the 20th century. All right. I'm a little over time, but I still want to be able to answer your questions, so I'm going to stay a little bit. stay a little bit, make sure I answer any questions you have. So go ahead and put your questions in the section down at the bottom if you got them, and I'll answer them until they run out. And by this point, I think you realize I don't have answers about the future. So if you wanted me to tell you anything else, I may not have those answers. First question here: has biological warfare been utilized as a strategy to wage war? So yes, in a way. As Hannah has said down here at the bottom, it's not a new concept, right? You can go back to the Mongols, like hurling plague-ridden bodies over the walls of cities, or the use of documented cases of blankets from smallpox patients being given to natives in the United States as examples of biological warfare in the past. What is, I think, noteworthy is that there have been attempts, certainly as the United Nations has come along, to try to limit this in the future and take action against countries suspected of this, or who are thought to maybe use biological weapons of some kind, and even chemical weapons as well, or unconventional weapons of war, as they're called. And so the United Nations has kind of been a really important platform for dealing with the possibility of using these weapons of war. And the United States certainly has taken a position on this, that we will not tolerate those types of weapons. Especially chemical weapons, which we believe were used in Syria, which we believe Saddam Hussein used in Iraq. Perhaps not when we invaded, but prior to that. Yeah, I think that is, it has been a strategy throughout all of history. Now, hopefully, will not be anymore, because we have kind of mechanisms in place, hopefully, that will continue to work to make sure that that is not happen, or at least does not happen on a wide scale. Interesting question there. Which details about this concept is most useful for the exam? Yes, are most useful for the exam, I guess, but Ashley caught her own grammar there. So thank you for the question, Ashley. I think for this key concept, knowing the Green Revolution will definitely pay off. That's something that I feel like comes up every year. Understanding our impact on the environment, you may get some questions that ask about our interaction with the environment throughout kind of like all of human history. And it might say something about, ask something about early in human history, and then maybe Industrial Revolution, and then in the 20th century. And so maybe knowing some of those examples, I think will be helpful there. Technology's impact on globalization, I think, is an important role. That's going to be something that's covered a little bit more in key concept 6.3, the kind of new global world as it develops. Technology plays an important role there. So maybe knowing that interconnectedness will allow you to make better connections if asked to do so in writing. Last year, I put a lot of time. Every year, I've kind of guessed something correctly on the exam. I put a lot of time into talking about the Green Revolution with my students last year, and it paid off on an SAQ. In other years, it may not. We have not had a question about those like diseases associated with poverty and epidemics and stuff. So that might be a possible question. I think that would be right for an SAQ, asking you to identify diseases and perhaps the effects, explaining the effects of diseases like the influenza pandemic, something like that. So that'd be my best guess. Again, my prognostication might be off because I don't have my oracle bones with me. All right. Gabby asked a very specific question about my class. I'm not going to answer that one, but the answer is yes. The UN has more power than the League of Nations, but I forgot why. Does it have an army or something? good question. So I think this is a fine time to just kind of briefly talk about the difference between these. The League of Nations was established after World War I. It was part of Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan, where he wanted to have an organization, kind of a world organization, much as Europe had the Congress of Vienna, to try to keep peace. The U.S. never joined it. Germany was never invited. Well, it was eventually invited, but not initially incorporated. Russia was never invited to the League of Nations. And the League of Nations had a lot of problems. One, every decision had to be ratified by every country. There were no real mechanisms for enforcing what was decided by the League. And then, of course, like the most powerful countries in the world were not a part of it. So that was problematic. The United Nations is developed after World War II. After a second massive global conflict, people started to understand perhaps they need to be serious about this. And so the United States and Soviet Union agreed to be a part of it. It was the UN was formed in San Francisco, headquarters put in New York City, which I got to visit a couple weeks ago. Shout out to my Model UN kids. So the UN does have greater power. Its structure is much very different from the structure of the League of Nations. But it does have peacekeeping forces. It does have mechanisms for enforcing resolutions passed by the United Nations, as long as they're not vetoed by the Security Council. And so, it does have greater ability to enforce its perhaps certain like sanctions that are put on countries or certain declarations. However, that is still very limited. The League of Nations, the UN still has a lot of limitations in what it can do, because it is dealing with all of these sovereign nations. So more power than the League of Nations, or more ability to enforce things in the League of Nations, but still somewhat limited. All right. So I think I've gotten down to the end of these questions. I think I've looked at all of them. So I'm sorry if I missed one that you had. Thank you for taking a look at this. I know I went a little long on this, but I guess everything I think is short is I have a lot to say. Y'all have some really fun questions today, so thanks for sticking with me here till the end. And I can't wait to do this again. We're getting closer and closer to the AP exam every second. The exam is approximately 51 days, 10 hours, and 45 minutes away if you're on Eastern time. So we'll be doing these a lot more frequently as we get closer and closer to the exam. Come with your questions. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have not signed up for access to beta test the app, I encourage you to hop on to Fiveable, join up, and request that. You can help make the app better and really help push as we come here to the end of the year. Anyways, it's been fun being with you. I'm going to end the broadcast. I'm going to go downstairs, get some dinner, and have a great day. All that stuff. Check you later, folks.